Hi, my name is James Rudyk, and I'm an adjunct faculty member at DePaul University in the School of Public Service, and I also work at the Northwest Side Housing Center, a community-based organization in Chicago, Illinois. And today, I'd like to talk to you about my experience waking up white. It starts 14 years ago when I was in the classroom. My first year of college, freshman political science class, talking about current events. I was in a group with a classmate who decided for current events to bring in an article from the Cleveland Plain Dealer that talked about how all Black women have children just to be on welfare and get money because they don't want to work. I remember my classmate sharing the article and talking about the numbers and how important it was for people to be held accountable and to have jobs, and that why do people not want to work and they're lazy. As I listened to my classmate talk, all I could think of is all of the Black women that I knew from my experience growing up in Cleveland, all of the people that I worked with at McDonald's, all of the people that were my neighbors. And I thought to myself, how could this article be right? How could this be what women in Cleveland are really experiencing? As I began to challenge my classmate and ask him questions about the article, about why he chose it, why were the facts presented the way that they were, about what the article was saying and whether or not he agreed with it, he stood by the numbers and the data. This only infuriated me more. And then I got my professor involved and I got the class involved and asked him if his article was appropriate and if people agreed with him. My classmate and I got into such a big fight that the professor actually asked me to leave class. Later on, when I talked with my professor about it, they said that it was okay to disagree, but that I couldn't do it in the way that I did in class. What I realized then was that was the first time in my life when I woke up white, when I realized that I was white and that there were people in this world who had never had experiences with people of color. That's when I realized that I was on my own identity journey of racial formation. My waking up white is also known as disintegration in racial identity formation speak. This theory is presented by Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum in the book Talking About Race and Learning About Racism. Dr. Tatum's racial formation theory argues that there's 6 stages of a white person's racial identity. This disintegration or waking up white was my second stage. Since then, over the past 14 years, I've been moving along my own racial identity formation journey, trying to understand what it means to be white and how to live an anti-racist life. What that's actually meant for me over the past 14 years is 3 things that I want to share with you today. The first of these is that in order to be anti-racist, you have to be proximate to people who are not like you. For me, that's understanding that being proximate to people of color in work, in your social settings, where you live, who you hang out with, is really key to understanding what it means to be a person of color in this country. I, as a white person, will never understand what people of color experience. As a man, I'll never understand what women experience. So for me, it's really important to understand and empathize with folks through being in relationship with them. Otherwise, I'm going to read an article and think that things that in that article are true about people. Instead, for me, I realize that this praxis, that really understanding, that questioning, comes from relationships that prove these stereotypes wrong. We live in a society where stereotypes are everywhere and are confronting us. The only way for us to break through those stereotypes, the only way for me to break through those stereotypes, is to have relationships that prove and tell me otherwise. That's why I think that is the important first step in my own racial identity formation. The second step for me, after I'm in relationship with people of color, is then to step outside of myself in those relationships and to really actively listen and learn from others. I'm often taught as a white male that my voice matters more and that when I enter a room, what I say is the most important thing. What I've had to learn is that I have to lead and listen to people of color, that I have to step back and allow people of color to lead, and I have to actively listen to what they say. It's important for me to understand that my experience as a white male is different from others, and to let their experience be central to conversations. One example that I can share is in a class I taught at DePaul 2 years ago. I was teaching a lesson on anti-racism in class, and we were talking about an article on white privilege by Becky McIntosh. As I was presenting that article to class, a woman of color asked why we started the conversation on race by talking about whiteness and white privilege. In that moment, I realized that as hard as I was trying to be anti-racist and to bring up the conversations of race, I myself centered the dialogue on anti-racism on whiteness. In that moment, I had a decision to make. Do I actively listen? Do I honor the voice of that student of color? As an educator, do I want my praxis and the learning in the classroom that I lead to be centered on the experiences of women of color or on myself as a white man? In that moment, it was really important that I stepped back and reflected and thought about my own racial identity formation and thought back to that experience I had 14 years earlier in college. It was from there that I was able to step back and let the experiences of that student, that woman of color, lead the class dialogue, and to this day has changed the way in which I teach race at DePaul. Making sure that I start the conversation from a perspective of a woman of color, not from a white person. That's one example of stepping outside of whiteness as normativity, stepping outside of white people as always leading the dialogue and as having our voices elevated. There are other examples, big and small, in my life that I've experienced in how I can step outside of my own whiteness and racial identity and let other individuals lead. In addition to proximity and in addition to allowing the voices of color to be elevated, I learned that then comes a true inflection point in which, in order for me to be truly anti-racist, I have to stand up, speak up, and challenge white supremacy and racism around me. I learned this lesson in listening to Dr. Ibram Kendi, who talks about how to be an anti-racist as an active choice that everyone has to make. That we as white people have to challenge systems and institutions. I took that to heart and decided that I myself have to challenge examples of white supremacy and racism that I see in my life, big and small. While these conversations have been really difficult for me and have been challenging, I've had to lean into them in order to make sure that I am reaching that full anti-racism potential that Dr. Kendi talks about. One example of a conversation I had to have was with my own family. I had to go home to Cleveland, Ohio, and hear my parents talk about President Trump. I then had to decide whether or not I was going to say anything and speak up and put into practice all of the conversations that I've had with myself, all of the learning that I had, the proximity that I had developed in my life, the stepping back as a white person that I've done, and decide if I was then going to take the step to challenge white supremacy and racism. It wasn't an easy conversation, and it's an ongoing conversation I'm still having with them. But for me, anti-racism lives in every time I challenge my parents' own understanding of race. Every time that I, as a white person, challenge other white people in the language that they use, in the actions that they take, and in the conversations that they have with other white people. It's important for me in those moments to support my friends and my loved ones and the people of color in my life and center myself as an anti-racist that challenges and speaks up against those things. To really be an ally and to really change the narrative on race in this country, I had to center myself in those conversations and speak up and stand up so that I can honor the experiences that people told me and truly live authentically as an anti-racist. I couldn't just talk about anti-racism. I couldn't just be friends with people of color. I had to actually actively make different choices and have different conversations. For me, that's at the center of my own journey of anti-racism and racial identity formation and waking up white. As Audre Lorde says, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. We must think differently and do things differently in order to end racism in this country. I see myself as one example of that as a white person who's willing to do things differently, who's willing to stand up, and who's willing to challenge and question the white supremacist and institutional racism that we see in our society today. It's individuals like myself and others that are truly allies that can help make a difference as we chip away at racism. I believe that making that active choice to be anti-racist came from me being willing to step back and listen to people of color, that came from being in proximity to people of color. Three-step process works in intersectionality, which means that though I applied this in my life to race, it also applies to gender, sexuality, ability, ethnicity, immigration status, age, and many other statuses. So for me as a white male, I also have to think about how does this apply to gender and to the dynamics in my relationships, and who am I proximate to as a male? Am I listening and letting women's voices and gender nonconforming individuals' voices be heard in conversations? And then am I also calling out, standing up and speaking up for women, LGBTQI individuals, and gender nonconforming individuals when I hear comments and I hear situations that also are about stereotypes and discriminate about them? So for me, this three-step framework of proximity, of stepping back, and then of being actively anti-racist through standing up and speaking out is applicable across the board. This is Audre Lorde's new tools to dismantle the racism, the homophobia, the heteronormativity, the male dominance, the misogyny that I see present in our society. And I hope today that through my own personal stories that I'm able to help white males like myself understand what it means to be anti-racist, what it means to be an ally, and how to make that active choice that Dr. Ibram Kendi talks about, and how to move along the journey that Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum talks about. I believe I'm still on the journey, and that my journey is going to continue. I'm here today just to share one small part of that journey with you as I continue on. Thank you.